William Koenig, a White House correspondent for how many years? 20 years. And of course, our hero, Ambassador David Friedman. Please, would you please come to this stage? And what a privilege it was yesterday to hear you at the Knesset, Ambassador. It was really a great moment. I was so excited. I was listening to your book, Sledgehammer. And this book just blew my mind. What happened behind the scenes, well, I hope you will talk about this.
Sure. Thank you, Albert. Thank you. Guys ready? Okay, okay? Keep talking, okay. Thanks, Albert. What a privilege it is to be back at the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. I've been here for almost all of them. And then the incredibly successful one in Dallas a couple months ago in March. And what a privilege it is to talk to Ambassador Friedman. It was interesting because I was at his Senate hearing, which was, you know, the Republicans were there in force, ready to support you. And it was very interesting. I was there for all 2.5 hours. And I was excited about it because right about a week after President Trump was inaugurated, Ambassador Friedman, prior to that, David Friedman, had the opportunity to be with 32 Christian leaders from around the country. I happened to be in San Diego that weekend, wasn't able to be there, but my friends said, you won't believe David Friedman's knowledge of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. He went through scripture after scripture after scripture, and they were so blessed, and we'd never had an ambassador like that. And fortunately for the Republicans, they stood strong with David Friedman throughout the hearing process. March 27, 2017, I think it was, or approximately that time, the Senate approved him. I think it was around 56-44, something like that. But the Republicans, once again, came through for Israel and gave us one of the best, I'd say the best ambassador the United States has ever had representing us. And when I speak to audience, I mentioned this to Ambassador Friedman before we came out. The audience across the country, Christians, even Jewish, appreciated what President Trump did for Israel. And I reiterate that he did more for Israel than all previous presidents combined. Just a few of them, and then and I'll connect some dots. He had the most pro-Israel administration in history. Christian Zionist, Mike Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, Nikki Haley, the most effective ambassador we've ever had at the UN for Israel, as well as Middle East envoy Jason Greenblatt, and even for a while, National Security Advisor John Bolton. They stood for Israel. And they were pro-Israel and unashamed to be pro-Israel. And then obvious, Ambassador Friedman. The U.S. move to Jerusalem, of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Clinton promised it, Bush promised it, Obama promised it, President Trump did it. As well as Secretary of State Pompeo saying that the settlements in Judea and Samaria are not illegal, according to the San Remo Agreement of 1922. Getting out of that terrible Iran nuclear deal, saying that Israel has the sovereign rights to the Golan Heights, standing up against the anti-Israel group within the international criminal courts, strongly opposing that, and on and on. There's many other things. But as I was putting my notes together, I thought, you know, President Trump did a remarkable job, but I guarantee Ambassador Friedman had a lot to do with the 15 or 20 things that actually happened during his 4 years in office. Ambassador Friedman had the opportunity to be involved directly with the Land for Peace, Peace to Prosperity Plan, and also the Abraham Accords. And Ambassador Friedman, just thank you for this incredible opportunity today. And if you could give us some insight, I know a lot of people within the country were concerned about the two-state plan, I think a lot of Christians wanted to see the 134 Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, that sovereignty extended to them. But, it's challenging. And there's probably no more challenging playing field than Israeli politics.
Well, thanks, Bill. So, look, I now that I'm out of office for a year and a half, I take a little bit of a different tack at it because I can look at it from the benefits of purely a private citizen, but someone who deeply loves and supports the state of Israel. Of course, I feel the same way about America. I think we're in a very, very critical time in the development of the state of Israel. And the way I look at it is this: I divide the history of modern Israel into three buckets. The first bucket is what I would call the Herzl and Ben-Gurion bucket. Took us from, the earliest part of the 20th century all the way through 1967. Israel was created by idealists, largely socialists. You wouldn't normally think of socialism as the right model for a Jewish state, but the challenges that faced Israel at that time were so severe that, again, in only God's mysterious ways, you needed this type of collective effort to build the state of Israel. It wouldn't have gotten done otherwise if it was if it was a free market. There needed to be a collective effort to get over the massive challenges at the beginning. Then, from 1967 till about now, I would call it the Begin era, right? I mean, Begin obviously was not the prime minister for all those years, but he was really, I think, the ideological North Star of this period. And Netanyahu just carried that forward, which is make Israel strong, make Israel, make sure people understand Israel's biblical history, make sure understand how important it is to be a Jewish state, make sure the army can defend itself, make sure that people understand the extraordinary place in history that we're at. And that took us mostly to where I would sort of say the end of the Trump administration. Now, I think we're really at a very interesting crossroads. And just to put it in context, the state of Israel is 74 years old. It is the longest period by 1 year, that a united Jewish commonwealth ruled over this land with Jerusalem as its capital. 73 years was King David and King Solomon. King David was 33, King Solomon was 40. That's 73. We now are ahead by 1 year. I tell everybody, that's not cause for celebrating. That's just a recognition of how fragile and tenuous life can be here in the Holy Land. And so the question is now, Israel exists. It's strong. It's got a terrific economy. Tel Aviv is the most expensive city in the world to live. I know people buying apartments there. I wish I could afford them, $10, $20, $30 million places on the water in Tel Aviv. We understand the importance of Israel as a Jewish state. We understand the place we are in the biblical continuum, the 4,000-year-old continuum from Abraham all the way till now. Now the question is, we defeated our enemies. What are we going to do now? And so in the long-winded answer to your question about sovereignty is, and I gave this speech on this past Thursday, and I put it very bluntly to 1,200 Israelis. I said, it's time for Israel to grow up. I said, there's 190 nations in the United Nations. More than half of them are younger than Israel. It's a big country, It may not be a big country geographically, but it's a real, mature, strong country punching way above its weight. And I said to them, I'll ask you a question that almost every other country in the world can answer, but you guys can't. What's your eastern border? What is it? It's your longest border. What is it? Is it the Jordan River? Is it the Green Line? Is it the settlements, but not all the settlements? What is it? It's been 55 years. What's your eastern border? And I said, if you don't decide this, and some other, whether it's the United States or another world body or the quartet, if anybody else decides this issue for you, shame on you. And you won't be happy with the outcome. And so, now, I think that, I sort of put it simply, I said, I think the world will respect Israel if Israel respects itself. And I think if Israel is not serious about its sovereignty, it's very hard to convince anyone that it's, I mean, if it doesn't act, with seriousness about its sovereignty, who will? So, so let me just make, I don't want to monopolize our time, but so, we're encouraging as best we can from the outside to say to the Israelis, create a national consensus. Don't just do this in the middle of the night. Create a national consensus. We gave you sort of a template, but create a national consensus where all the, there is no excuse and there's no basis by which the holy sites of the Jewish people and of the Christian people, from Nazareth to Shechem and the altar of Joshua, to Shiloh, to Bethel, to Jerusalem, to Rachel's tomb, to Bethlehem, to Hebron, to Beersheba. Beersheba is already, part of it, but all the other places. How could this not be part of the state of Israel? How could Shiloh, the tabernacle rested in Shiloh for 369 years. It's the place where essentially prayer was invented, where Hannah prayed for the first time. How is that not part of the state of Israel? Bethel, where Jacob had a dream of a ladder, angels descending and going. God promised him that he would make Jacob into a great nation like he promised Abraham. How could that not be part of the state of Israel? The grave of Rachel, who died in childbirth and continues to this day, by our tradition, to pray for her children that they will return home. How could that not be part of the state of Israel? So Israel has to come to that view. So what are we doing about that? And I'll get back to you. So dear friend Mike Pompeo and I just finished filming a documentary. It's called Route 60, The Biblical Highway. It'll be out in October. And he and I, we did this with TBN. We got 3 film crews because it was so complicated, the logistics. We got 2 helicopters and 3 film crews. We started filming in Nazareth, and then we jumped ahead to the altar of Joshua, to Shiloh, to Bethel, to Jerusalem, to Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, and Hebron and Beersheba. This one road, Route 60, is the biblical spine of the Jewish and the Christian faith. I mean, it's the same road that Jesus came when he visited the temple. It's the same road that Abraham traveled when he began in the north and headed down to Beersheba. I say it's the first, Beersheba is the first Abraham Accord, right? Forget about what we did. The first Abraham Accord was Abraham and Avimelech when they fought over the well in Beersheba. That's the first Abraham Accord with the real Abraham. So we made this documentary, and what people are going to understand when they see this, it's not political. We don't talk about a political outcome, but people will understand how foundational Judea and Samaria is, these sites along Route 60, how foundational they are to the Jewish people and to the Christian people and to why we all care so much about the state of Israel.
Ambassador Friedman, I was at the White House on January 28th, 2020, when the Peace to Prosperity Plan was introduced. And I know you had a briefing with Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, or former, and Tony Perkins and other Christian leaders, and you were very favorable, hoping that there would be annexation, or I think we prefer to call it extended sovereignty, to the 134 Jewish communities. And it appeared at the time that Jared Kushner said, no, we better not, that'll be a deal breaker. I think that was a concern because Israel was going to, just like these areas that you're talking about, these are biblically significant to Israel and to the Christians. And it seemed like the White House effort pretty much slowed that and squelched that and stopped that. I think from Christians that understand that God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the land from the Euphrates to the great river in Egypt. That's the biblical heartland of Israel, Judea and Samaria. And I think some of us have a difficult time envisioning an Arab state in Judea and Samaria. But as you know, when that became incredibly contentious during that summer, people are saying, no, Israel, stop it. I mean, the international community was going bonkers, thinking that Netanyahu was going to, you were directly involved in that. And a lot of us were hoping that he would go ahead and do it boldly. And we appreciate the Abraham Accords. There's a lot of positives there. Great relations. These are normalization relations. These are business relations, which I think is wonderful. But it continued. It's like right after the Abraham Accords was signed at the White House, These Arab leaders were at the UN saying, we would have never signed that if it hadn't have been for annexation being stopped. I mean, the leaders involved in the signing and other Arab leaders at the UN a couple weeks after that. So what it did, it continued the two-state narrative. It continued the focus on two states living side by side in peace and security, UN 242, UN 338, and it stopped what we considered the rightful extension of sovereignty to 132 Jewish communities. So that's a...
Listen, I share your disappointment. I also share your pride in the Abraham Accords there, but I also agree with you. I'm going to agree with you a third time, which is that the two are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And they don't need to be mutually exclusive. And ultimately, look, one of the things that came out of that whole process was we began a discussion. Okay, we took it from the world of the toxic to the world that it's now something people can talk about in polite company. We talked about in this plan how important it is for Israel to control this land, and the Jewish people have the right to remain on this land. And we didn't, Israel was not asked to cancel it. It was asked to just put it off a little bit. And so now the question is, what do we do now? And so, look, I think we do two things. Most important is to support the Israeli government in this position, meaning, look, at the end of the day, the United States is extraordinarily important. I don't want to minimize the importance of the United States, but Israel has to decide this issue for Israel. I mean, and so we need to encourage Israel to feel that it has friends that will support it when it makes that decision. One of the reasons that we didn't go forward, I mean, look, there were issues in America. We had COVID. We had people didn't want to make any more, didn't want to, begin any more tough issues. But the biggest problem was really in Israel. We had a government where the prime minister wanted to move forward, and the defense minister and the foreign minister at the time were against it. So a decision which is this complicated and controversial, to ask the prime minister to go forward when his foreign minister and defense minister are doing everything they can not to. So you got to get Israel right first, because at the end of the day, as I said, Israel can make a very strong case, and we've given it all the powers and tools it needs to make a strong case that every single Jewish community in Judea and Samaria and more belongs to the Jewish state. Look, let's take Joseph's tomb, right? That's in Area A. It's impossible to get to, and there's almost no one having a conversation right now about how to Jews and Christians go back to Joseph's tomb. Pompeo and I couldn't get there. Our only chance was the IDF was going to get us there at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we couldn't go with the chopper because it would make too much noise and wake up people who would get angry. So we had to park the helicopter far away, and then so we just decided we weren't going to do it. But look, the whole, people say to me, how do you make good Zionists? and the answer is, you don't need to try to make good Zionists. You need to make good Christians and good Jews. If you're a good Christian or a good Jew, you're going to be a good Zionist. It comes with the territory, And so, all the people out there, all the political, pundits and everybody who's running around talking about what Israel's security needs are and what the economy and they play like you remember the game of Risk I used to play as a kid, where you're moving little pieces on, geopolitical. It's that they're just playing Risk. They're just playing games with other people's lives. At the end of the day, Israel's not Singapore. It's not. It's not a
different neighborhood.
It's not, and it's also not Singapore, because it's where our collective faith began and where it continues to live and to thrive. And so, it's the faith that makes Israel the great country that it is. It's the only, from my perspective, speaking as a Jew, it's the only place in the world where I can go, pray at the same place, in the same language, the same liturgy that my ancestors did 2,000 years ago, right? I mean, there's no other place like that. And without faith as the core of our, support for Israel, then Zionism is kind of irrelevant, because nobody on any college campus in America that's other than maybe the handful that maybe support the Christian world, you can't be pro-Israel and get tenure. We're not going to fight this fight on the basis of politics. We're going to fight it on the basis of faith, and that's the way that we strengthen the relationship.
Well, these are certainly exciting times. Pastor in Dallas, W.A. Criswell, used to say, Southern Baptist pastor, is a great friend of Israel. If you want to know where things standing biblically and prophetically, watch what's happening with the city of Jerusalem. And when you think about it today, and many Christians in the United States says the best president we had was Trump and the best prime minister was Netanyahu. And both of them are out of office right now. So obviously we're moving into a very unique period of time. Supposedly Biden will be coming to Israel in a couple of weeks. We're following some of his efforts with Blinken, with some of the Abraham Accord leaders.
Yeah.
And it seems like we're moving into a very challenging and precarious time. And like what you're saying, Ambassador Friedman, is Israel's going to have to stand strong and take care of themselves because no one else is going to be there for them.
I think that's true, and I think that we need to help people care about Israel from its biblical and historical perspective. I'll give you an example. I had never before, all my times in Israel, all the time that I was a private citizen and ambassador, I had never been to Joshua's altar, right? It's almost impossible to get to. We landed right by it on a helicopter. I mean, you would really need to be a scout, to find it. Now, to me, this is a place of enormous historical significance to the Jewish people, right? Joshua brings the Israelite nation across the Jordan River. He's taking over for the greatest leader that the Jewish people have ever known or will ever know. He's following Moses, right? Imagine what it's like to follow Moses. He takes them in. What does he do? He begins to fight, right? Because he's coming into a new land. He fights with Jericho, successful with Jericho. Then he fights this nation of Ai. He loses the first battle, wins the second battle. Then he takes a deep breath and he says, wait a minute, I'm a leader. I'm not just a general. I have to lead this nation. How do I lead this nation? And then he goes and he builds this altar and he writes his own set of the Ten Commandments, and he takes ownership of the faith, not just of the people of the faith. And this altar is where the Jewish nation really became a nation, because its leader finally, assembled not just the obligation to fight, and the stones are made, right, they're all uncut, because God says, don't build me an altar with weapons of war. I want uncut stones. So you see this place, it's all uncut stones pieced together to form, and it's 3,000 years old, right? And this is where the Jewish people became a nation. Now, I don't know, has anybody ever been there? Okay, great. So, but I'm saying, very few people go there. I mean, it's very hard to get to this place. And it is one of the most significant places in the history of the world. And it's right, of course, smack in Samaria. So we can't give this stuff up. I mean, we're giving it, it's like, would America give up the Lincoln Memorial? Would America give up the Statue of Liberty? These things are as essential, and much more essential because they go back thousands of years. These things are essential to the Jewish nation and to the Jewish faith and to the Christian faith. And that's the argument I believe that we will win on, because people will argue the politics until their heads explode, but nobody can argue the Bible. No one wants to pick a fight with God, and that's the fight that we ought to be fighting, alongside God, because we'll win that fight.
Can you imagine your ambassadors to Israel giving us a big biblical lesson like this? Wouldn't that be incredible? And that is the difference of having Ambassador Friedman here in Israel, a defender of the state of Israel, understanding what the scriptures say about the land of Israel, and to be put in a position as the U.S. ambassador to Israel at such a very key and important time. And Only God knows how this is all going to play out. Your final thoughts, Ambassador Friedman, where we are right now, going, it'll probably take a long time.
Look, I want to share with the audience something which maybe you know this or don't, but it struck me, resonated with me. The oldest, most prolific biblical commentator in the Jewish faith was Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. He was referred to as Rashi. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of him. He asked a question in the very first sentence of the Bible, the book of Genesis. He asked a question: Why is God telling us about the creation of the world? Why do we care? You know, why did the Jewish people care how the world was created? Why do we care? You know, we've been given 613 commandments. The first commandment doesn't begin until the book of Exodus, which tells us to observe the new moon, the new month. So what is this all about? You know, and what he says, and this is 1,000 years ago, he says is absolutely astounding. He says, one day, the nations of the world will come to Israel and say, you don't own this land. And when they do, the response is, God gave us this land, and God created the world, and he could have given the land to anybody who wants to, and he gave it to us. And so 1,000 years ago, picture this, this fight has not moved an inch in 1,000 years. 1,000 years ago, a Spanish-French commentator on the Bible says that the only reason that we learn about God's creation of the world is essentially to create a title insurance policy for the Jewish people to the land of Israel, that we can track our title back to God because he created the earth. And that's what's at stake here. That's how important this is. 1,000 years, you know, of the Jewish people, more 2,000 years, praying and praying to return to this land. And in our lifetime, you know, my grandparents or great-grandparents could not have imagined the day that they could, you know, call a travel agent, get on a plane, and come pray at the Western Wall. It was unthinkable. And now it's so easy. 5-star hotels, got a Waldorf Astoria sitting here in the middle of Jerusalem. You know, nothing. You know, what are we waiting for? You know, we got to move forward. This is the time. We're now, you know, the number one. We're ahead of every other point in history in terms of ruling this land, you know, from a capital in Jerusalem. Now is really the time to put the foot on the gas and do what God commands us.
That's great. And one last thing is, when I talk to Protestant and Catholic people and leaders even, I mentioned to them the Abrahamic covenant land is for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. Not all descendants of Abraham. I had an argument with the top people in the ELCA Lutheran Church. They've taken their website down. I said, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. They said, how about Genesis, I think it was 16 or 13. I said, here's 10 scriptures in the Bible that says that the land is for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I didn't hear back from them. So for us to continue to stand and defend the land of Israel, take them to the scriptures. What the scriptures talk about is the Abrahamic covenant. It's an everlasting covenant. In other words, it's still in place. And the land is for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. It is their covenant land. And Ambassador Friedman couldn't have put it better. So thank you all. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
This was absolutely fabulous. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming. Absolutely fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, William. Thank you. This was fantastic. I would recommend you to look up Ambassador Friedman's book, Sledgehammer. You will be overwhelmed by the stories behind the scenes, what happened, how the embassy was moved, what obstacles, and in which way these obstacles were overcome.